Okay, so with us today we have the Athletics Newcastle writer George Caulkin and Manchester United writer Carl Anka. This is an opening question to you both, really. I guess you've got two clubs here in Newcastle United and Manchester United who are close in the league, but I guess the mood in both camps is very different, George.
Yeah, I mean it's been a tough season in different ways for both clubs, obviously, but these things are relative. I mean it is quite sort of funny in some ways how only 3 points and a couple of league positions can separate the two clubs, but in Newcastle's case there is a feeling of positivity. They're in decent form. It's been a draining season in terms of injuries and their first European campaign, certainly in the Champions League for 20 years, and having to sort of get through that. But they have done it, and they're sort of heading into the final week full of confidence. And I think if they can get back into Europe, if they can finish in the top 6, 7, it would represent a really, really good follow-up season to last time, which was obviously a huge breakthrough for them.
Positivity at Old Trafford, Carl?
Unfortunately not. It really feels like Newcastle United are in the ascendancy right now. Their form since the new year especially has been good, and they've returned to what my friends have politely described as Atletico Tyneside. So hard, robust, aggressive, a fantastic counter-pressing force. Whereas Manchester United are in absolute freefall. One Premier League victory since the start of April. And they're injury depleted and with little idea as to how they're going to get the next victory.
George, you've got 2 games left in the season from a Newcastle perspective. Europa League qualification looks in decent shape, but you do have to go away to Old Trafford and also at Brentford as well. Let's say Newcastle do get the Europa League this season. Is that a sign of success from your perspective?
100%. Yeah, 100%. And it doesn't have to be the Europa League. I think there are different ways of looking at this. Firstly, you can make the argument that the Champions League and also getting to the quarterfinal at both domestic cup competitions, which a few years ago, I mean, that would have been absolutely unheard of. It just didn't happen under Mike Ashley ownership. The club didn't get beyond the 3rd round or the 4th round of the FA Cup in particular. I mean, it has stretched them. It's stretched the squad to translucency. They've had horrific injury problems, as we know, but they've got through it. I think that it's vital that having got into Europe once, that they follow it up, that they do it again. Now, that's not just important in terms of the players they're looking to sign this summer and beyond. It's really important to the players that they already have. They have to show that Europe is their natural home now. They have to show that they're progressing. Now, if you look at that in different ways, yes, they've spent money on their training ground, but they haven't built a new training ground. Then they have plans for their stadium, but that hasn't happened yet. They're not the biggest wage payers in the Premier League. They are curtailed by PSR, by financial fair play, so they can't go out and spend shed loads of money. So how do they show that they're progressing? Well, they show progression by being in Europe. So yeah, it's really, really important. It's vital that they can prove to people like Alexander and Isak and Bruno Guimarães that they can play in Europe and that they can fill their ambitions on Tyneside.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the next 2 games. As we said, they're both away games, and I mean, home form for Newcastle hasn't been that bad. It's been actually really, really good. Away from home, though,
it's been better than last season. I mean, it's only by a point, but that's incredible considering they finished 4th. Yeah, amazing.
But away, though, that's where the difficulties do arise, though, for Newcastle. And you've got 2 key away games for Manchester United, who would be looking to end the season with some sort of glory. Of course, we've got the FA Cup final still coming along, but also
fun asterisks.
You have to put it in there. But the reality is, away form hasn't been great for Newcastle. How did they turn this around in such a quick succession?
Well, they can't turn it around. They've lost 10 league games this season, and you have to go down. You have to go a long way down the table to Brentford, who I think are in 16th, to find another team who've lost more games than them away from home. I mean, it's been a really poor record, and yeah, there is the context and mitigation of injuries, as I said, but it doesn't explain the disparity. How do they turn it around? Well, they've got to. They have to. They have shown in the last couple of months. They had a really important moment when they went out of the FA Cup to Man City, which of course, in itself, not a surprise at all. But I think their season was sort of on a knife edge at that point. It was a big turning point. That was their last chance to win something, which of course Newcastle don't do. We know that. But that was their last chance, and they were 10th in the Premier League at that point. I think teams like Brighton and Wolves were above them, and there was I wouldn't say fear, but there was certainly concern internally that, what happens if you start asking that question? Well, where are we going as a team? Where are we going as a club? If those big players that I mentioned earlier started asking each other and themselves, could they fulfill their ambition at Newcastle? Now, since then, they went away to Dubai. They had a kind of week there, 10 days there, and they came back with an answer to that question. And they've played really, really well since then. They've won away at Fulham. They've won away at Burnley. They've also lost at Crystal Palace, which obviously Manchester United have done as well. So they have found a way of digging results out. But yeah, their draw against Brighton at the weekend was a bit deflating. But they've put huge pressure on that home form with that, with their record away from home. So they've got to do something about it in these last two matches. They've got to get something from these games.
George, can I ask, the 4-3 victory over West Ham at the end of March, that felt more like the Newcastle of last season, and that felt like the beginning of this turnaround in form.
Yeah, that was the first game after the international break, after the non-international players had gone away to Dubai. I mean, it's difficult to sort of draw conclusions from that match because it was so chaotic. It was like so messy. But yeah, they found a way through it, and I think they have taken one thing that you can say from this season. It's been themeless in lots of ways, but last season went so well for them. It was so kind of perfect. Everything flowed. They were brilliant, but it was a happy experience. It was a joyous experience. You would go to matches and still have that kind of sense of surprise when Newcastle won. And it hasn't been like that this season, but they found a way through. And I think they're certainly internally, they're taking a lot of pride from the way that they've responded to adversity. And, that's why I would say that, qualifying for Europe, whatever the competition, would be up there with anything they achieved last season, simply because they've had far more hurdles to overcome this time.
The success comes from Newcastle United's ability to steer into the skid and not go off course.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely that.
And it's that overcoming adversity in reality that you've got to ask, where do we look at Eddie Howe's job moving forward? You get a sense that the fans are behind him, but those rumours will still be there, George, for sure. Is he good enough to take Newcastle to the next phase?
Yeah, I mean, there's been this sort of almost parallel situation since the takeover happened, which was, firstly, they're going to go out and sign Mbappe. They're going to go out and, try and sign all the big players. And then the same thing around the manager. And again, internally, there's been no pressure on him, apart from the pressure there's pressure in the sense that they long-term want to be up there, absolutely amongst the elite. There's that pressure which drives everybody on. But no, the relationships inside the club are very, very strong. He has done a phenomenal job. His name is sung repeatedly by fans. It always has been. There was noise around, November, December, because it was such a sort of difficult time and there was such a kind of poor run of results. But, I've said, on our podcast, Pull on the Time, that, I think he's the best thing to happen to Newcastle in football terms for a generation. I mean, I really believe that. He's kind of summoned up this identity that kind of Newcastle fans didn't even kind of have for themselves after being sort of beaten down under the Ashley era. This kind of aggressive, strong, in your face, you kind of attitude, which has been kind of brilliant to watch. And no, I think he's been absolutely brilliant. And I think after what he did in terms of leading the club away from relegation and then finishing fourth, getting to a cup final, don't really want to talk about that. Last season, he'd earned the right to have a bad season. I mean, but I don't think it's been a bad season. But he'd earned the right. Yeah, he's been brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, in direct contrast, you're talking about this style of football, Carl. There's another United team, Manchester United, who I guess haven't played great, but yes, they are in a cup final. Let's not forget that there's a slim light at the end of the tunnel. But you look at what's happening at Newcastle in terms of within the hierarchy, within the dugout. There's a solid sense of stability, and you look at Manchester United, and that's completely different.
Yes.
Do you think that has definitely contributed to what we're seeing on the pitch
Very
and how
much,
this team will operate?
very much so. So George's comment there about Eddie Howe earning the right to have a bad season.
Mm-hmm.
In the nicest way, that is a baffling concept to a Manchester United fan.
Right.
Because Manchester United, you cannot have a bad season. You cannot earn the right to have a bad season. The only person who ever earned that right was Sir Alex Ferguson, and he did that because he won a metric boatload of trophies beforehand. It was Erik Ten Hag. He had some credit in the bank with a victory in a certain League Cup final. I don't know against what team it was. But the idea for a Manchester United manager is once you achieve one thing well, you have to progress, iterate, constantly execute, constantly get better and better and better. And the idea going into Manchester United into this season was that United would possibly finish third again, but possibly close that gap to Manchester City and the other rival for the Premier League title. We didn't know if it would be Arsenal, we didn't know if it would be Liverpool. But the idea was Manchester United would be in the top 4 places. Erik Ten Hag said the ambition in pre-season was to turn Manchester United into the best transition team in the world. And the only sort of transition we've seen is them transitioning to a very mediocre football team. And the interesting contrast between Manchester United and Newcastle United are both of these teams on the crest of the wave last season, and they've both had their injury depletion, and the responses to having your squad be decimated by injury has been really, really interesting. Eddie Howe had that difficult winter, and then you sort of, and this is my outside opinion looking in, sort of slowly grew in the new year. They stuck to their principles. They attempted to play a style of football that they knew when these players would get back, this would come good, and then you saw that come good. Isak came good, and whatnot. Erik Ten Hag has attempted to do that and say we'll continue playing this transition style of football, and then when Casemiro gets back, it'll be better, and when Lisandro Martinez comes back, it will be better. Now, what happened was Lisandro Martinez came back, and it was better for a little bit, and then Koufal fell on his knee at Old Trafford, so he was away for a bit. And when Casemiro came back, Casemiro does not look like the Casemiro of last season. He does not look like the Casemiro of his glittering Real Madrid career. So Ten Hag's principles and his adherence to his principles have gone from being what you describe as a confident forthrightness to sometimes looking stubborn, if not childish. So United have gone in freefall while Newcastle have picked things up. And we, on our podcast, Talk of the Devils, there was, I want to say, at the start of April, Andy Mitten pointed out Manchester United keep looking at the top of the table, keep looking at Tottenham Hotspur and Aston Villa in 4th and 5th, where they should be looking downwards because Newcastle were mounting. And I think it took a little bit too long for Manchester United to realise that they didn't have their houses in order. And now they're in a situation where we're talking now, they're 8th in the table, they're behind Newcastle United, they're behind Chelsea, they're behind these two teams that have found some sort of tactical fluency, where Manchester United seem completely bereft of it. And it looks really bad. I'm so sorry to listeners if I come across as a negative Nelly. I don't like being this negative.
It's totally fascinating that, you know, the idea of potentially winning the FA Cup and this being a bad season, you know, that those two things can go together. Because obviously, you know, and I'm not trying to compare the clubs at all, although there's been this interesting relationship between them, I think, since Newcastle came back into the Premier League in 1993. But you know, the idea. I mean, if Eddie Howe won any trophy for Newcastle, that's automatically a statue. And you know, it's yeah, the concept of winning the FA Cup and having an unsuccessful season is sort of astonishing to me. And I do understand the Manchester United context.
Can I ask you though, Carl? When have you seen this season Manchester United playing the type of football that Erik Ten Hag has explicitly said this team are capable of?
40 minutes against Tottenham Hotspur in the second game of the season. 20 minutes.
You have to go that far back.
This is how bad the injury crisis has been. So Manchester United started the first game of the season. Rasmus Højlund was brought in, couldn't play because he was dealing with a back ailment. But that was as close to their best 11 that Ten Hag wanted. So Marcus Rashford was down the middle. So even then, you know, match week 1, nearly everyone is there. All of your brand new players are there, and you still don't have your million plus striker. And that game against Wolverhampton Wanderers, we saw Ten Hag's idea to play with almost like a 4-1-4-1 and have Mason Mount push up and join Bruno Fernandes just be completely torn apart by Wolverhampton Wanderers. They probably could have got themselves a result. I'm sure if any Wolves fans are listening to this, they'll point out the fact that Andre Onana basically uppercutted a player and probably should have given away a penalty for VAR with VAR, but it wasn't awarded. And then there was a good 40 minutes against Tottenham Hotspur, and in the second half, Ange Postecoglou simply made his centre-back stand further apart during build-up play, which helped bypass often inconsistent front pressing attempt from Manchester United. Then went to the next game against Brighton, where it took De Zerbi 20 minutes to figure out how to bypass this press. I remember rewatching that game, and you can see after Brighton scored their first goal, De Zerbi's doing with his hands a wider gesture to Louis Dunk. I don't know why I've called him Louis Dunk there. I'm just putting a little bit of flair. Louis Dunk. And this has been a real trouble in that Ten Hag's plan for the season was figured out 3 games into the season. A number of very, very intelligent managers going, their press is not the best. If you make your centre-back stand further apart during build-up, that front 3 cannot cover that much ground. And Ten Hag's idea as to how football or how this Manchester United team should play ideally relies on his players winning 80 to 95% of their individual 1v1 duels. It is all about, can your defensive midfielder stem the flow? Can your winger beat their fullback and whatnot? At a time where football was becoming more about collective principles, more about what you do in pods. And a great example of this is this Newcastle United team, because Eddie Howe's team, they hunt in packs. They go after the ball in 2 or 3 units. They figure if one of us can't get the ball, 2 or 3 will be able to do it. Their wide players track back. So it's always one winger against 2 Newcastle players and whatnot. Whereas Manchester United are doing a lot more 1v1 solo duels, which means you need your players to be fit, which hasn't happened too often, and they also need to be on a good day. And when your team is having so many injuries, it's really hard to be on a good day because the other person who also needs to be on a good day might not be there. And we've seen this so many times this season where Marcus Rashford, Alejandro Garnacho, left-sided forwards, are having a good day, but also they're struggling because there's no left-back. And there's no left-back to give those overlaps. So both of these wide players are going, oh, God, no, I have to deal with 2 of these players because I haven't got someone to offer an overlapping run to distract one of them. So it's been really, really hard. And Ten Hag hasn't changed these principles to this more collective mindset that we're seeing in Newcastle.
All I'd say about that is that, I think there are parallels there, because if you go back to the first game of the season, Newcastle absolutely hammer Aston Villa 5-1 at home. They're able to bring on incredible substitutes, 70-minute mark. Now, that was the template for what Newcastle wanted to do this season, the way they wanted to play. Now, almost immediately, that went out the window because we can have a United injury face-off, if you like, about which clubs had it worse. But by the time November, December kind of comes along, Howe's in the position where he's having to name the same team week in, week out. And at the time, it felt like, why isn't he doing something different? Why is he still trying to play the same way? Why isn't he trying to change formations? Now, in those moments, you need your manager to find a different way of winning. If it's not working like that, then do something else, or ask your players to do something. Now, I suppose the comparison here is that Newcastle have found a way through that. Eventually, it's been really tough and really difficult, and there's been a lot of questions asked internally as they go along. But they had faith in themselves, and they had faith in the manager, and they had faith ultimately in the club and what was happening. So they weren't able to go out and buy anybody in January. They didn't have any money, but that faith and that belief kept them together. And now it sees them come strong when suddenly this last weekend they didn't beat Brighton, but suddenly they've got Nick Pope, Trippier, Harvey Barnes on the bench. They've got Joelinton on the bench. They've got Almiron on the bench. They're getting back to the position that they hoped to be in at the start of the season, and they've come through intact. Where it feels very much from the outside that with Man United, they've come through fragmented.
Yeah,
this is a really interesting thought process because, I'm sure Ten Hag and others at Manchester United would have gone, we did the same thing as Newcastle.
Yeah.
We had faith. We decided not to change our methods. We decided to try and pull together and to try and come through together. Now, to go back to the injury off, the players most essential to Newcastle, from my opinion, were able to be in the starting lineup for Newcastle longer than the players more essential to Manchester United's plans. And one thing I'm really interested in, George, is the League Cup final game between these two sides. Newcastle came to Old Trafford playing, frankly, too many fullbacks because you were so injured.
All the fullbacks.
All the fullbacks.
Literally everyone.
All of the fullbacks. And Manchester United, I want to say, had slightly better injury luck at the time.
Yeah.
But the question was, after Newcastle were victorious, was how comes the Newcastle team with all the fullbacks have a clearer way of playing than Manchester United at this point in time, which began this very, very, very large conversation that was ongoing and has been ongoing throughout the majority of 2024, which is what is Ten Hag trying to do?
Yeah.
Now, we talk about your manager tries to find a way to win. Howe's version of trying to find a way to win, I will leave it to George to explain. Manchester United's way of trying to win, Ten Hag essentially went, I'm going to turn football games into a coin toss. So Ten Hag more or less reckoned that his attacking players were better than the majority of attacking players in the Premier League. And rather than try and hunker down deep and protect things in midfield, he thought if I press really high and try and win the ball up, then my forwards will have a shorter distance to goal, so we might score. And if we don't, then if they bypass, we've got a number of centre backs who are quite good in and around the penalty area, and they can block and stop shots. So this became a very weird style of football where, and you've seen this if you watch any Manchester United game for any length of time, there's just huge gaps in midfield. And this is Ten Hag's formulation of well, we've got good forwards and we've got good centre backs. So the midfield will kind of sort itself out, maybe. Which is a very ambitious, very unorthodox way of trying to win games. But for a little bit, it looked like it was working. And then another player got injured. And then things got a bit weird again. Whereas for Newcastle, that way to win, was that counter-pressing? Was that collective grabbing after the ball?
George,
what was it?
George, answer this super quickly because I also want to ask Carl very quickly. I think he's stalling about the game against Newcastle on Wednesday, but go for it.
I was there in November, and I mean, I suppose I would say at that point was that Newcastle were in a real high point in terms of form. It wasn't too long after they'd beaten Paris Saint-Germain for 1. They would go on to beat Arsenal at home in that contentious game straight afterwards. I was in the away end that night. It was really hilarious, let me just say that. But it was also, it was Newcastle's biggest victory at Old Trafford for something like 90 years. I mean, that puts into context how poor Newcastle's record has been at Old Trafford. But at that point, it didn't really matter who came into Newcastle's team because Howe's methods are so ingrained. He works incredibly hard, and the players have to work incredibly hard to kind of get to grips with what he wants to do. It didn't matter that he played 95 fullbacks. They all knew exactly what they had to do and where they were supposed to play, what their jobs were, what everybody else's jobs were, and it worked. Now, I know you said very quickly, but just to kind of follow that up, I think 2, 3, 4 weeks later, 5 weeks later, Newcastle had been so stretched and they had no substitutes. I mean, the away game at Paris Saint-Germain, Howe was unable to make any substitutes. Now, the way that they play is based on that ferocious running, that pressing, counter-pressing, all of that stuff. At that point, they were able to do that. Within a month or two afterwards, they weren't. But yeah, I would argue that having that identity has been incredibly important to Howe and Newcastle. And now, at last, we're beginning to kind of see that again.
Yeah, well, let's go to you, Carl, now and talk about the match against Newcastle. Manchester United versus Newcastle at Old Trafford. George talks about methods being ingrained. Talks about players coming back. Newcastle are looking like they found their flair again. Manchester United was come off a underwhelming 1-0 defeat to Arsenal at home. Old Trafford used to be the fortress. How do you see this match going?
Scrappy. Very scrappy. Erik Ten Hag has a limited amount of solutions for an ever-growing list of problems due to this injury noise, mess, crisis, however you want to describe it. He spent Manchester United are going to go into this game again without a specialist left back due to injuries to ongoing, long-term injuries to Luke Shaw and Terrell Malacia. They will be playing with either they move Dalot back to right back, who's been a very good player this season, or they continue with Aaron Wan-Bissaka at right back. Wan-Bissaka, we know how good he is as a 1v1 tackler, has his weaknesses in other areas that I'm sure Eddie Howe and his team are well aware of and will be looking to exploit. In terms of centre-back, Arsenal, the game against Arsenal, the game against Crystal Palace, saw Casemiro, a defensive midfield player, play next to Johnny Evans. Yeah. So if this sounds as me being pessimistic and saying I'm not expecting much, I'm really sorry. But this is to borrow George's term, this is a team that's been stretched thin to the point of translucent. And there are very few obvious ways you can say Manchester United are superior based on which players are in that starting lineup. Rasmus Højlund, who had found a little bit of form at the start of the new year, hasn't had a great amount of form in recent games. He's averaging an XG of 0.24 per shot, which is good. No, one second. So
I was ready to defend the lad.
This is it, right?
I'm not even a Manchester United fan. I was ready to defend.
I was just dropping some stats that I thought was bad, and it was a compliment, and I didn't get time to explain it.
To hearing bad news around United.
So
Manchester United.
Rasmus Højlund currently averaging an XG of 0.24 per shot. That is good. That is very good. That is the sort of stuff your stats boffins, and I'm not wearing my glasses right now, but if you can imagine me putting my big nerd voice and pushing my glasses up my nose going, that is fantastic, and that's the sort of thing that you want from people like Erling Haaland and other top strikers in the league like Alexander Isak. The problem is he is not shooting anywhere near enough to make good on that promise. He is nowhere near the top 10 for strikers in the Premier League who have played more than 500 minutes. So Højlund, all the metrics are going, this guy, in and around the penalty area, big thumbs up, 2 thumbs up. But he's not getting anywhere near enough shots off because the team around him are not able to put him in the position where he can just focus on shooting, which he's very good at. They don't get enough balls into the box. He's not the best in the air in terms of headers, but he's very good at attacking the near post. But that's not really happening at this point in time. So this is the real difficult thing about Manchester United is they don't feel like a team right now. The squad is basically a patchwork quilt or a Frankenstein's monster of players bought on the Mourinho, players bought on the Van Gaal, players bought on the Solskjaer, players bought on the Ten Hag, and they've all got slight, contrasting and not quite complementary profiles. And then the players that are there who are very good at connecting that tissue are either injured or underperforming because other people are injured, as I've said before. I mean, I don't want to talk about Casemiro too much because everyone's been talking about Casemiro recently, and I just feel really mean talking about him, but he was the captain of Brazil at the start of the season, and now he's not even going to the Copa America. That's how bad things have gone at Manchester United, that even players as talented and decorated as Casemiro have just gone.
Could we add Varane to that list? I don't know if
Yes.
The conversation.
Well, I was going to say, Carl. I mean, that ultimately, for all that is the difference. So even during Newcastle's worst moments, they looked like a team and they were a team, and you knew that they had that collective spirit and togetherness. And with Manchester United, it's the opposite. I mean, Newcastle are a brilliant team, and I mean that in the most old-fashioned, pure sense of the word possible. They are a collective unit. It's been tough for them at times this season. They've had some terrible results and some bad performances, but they are a team, and that has shone through. That's what they've drawn on.
Okay, well, let's move on to the precarious conversation around European football. And for both teams in particular, actually, I think this is going to be quite an interesting chat, especially starting with Newcastle, George, whether it's Europa League or Conference League. I find this incredible irony that we're all gunning in the Premier League for European football, but actually it could mean a depletion of teams. It could mean huge injuries, would actually allow our team to falter in the league. Do you know what I mean? Do Newcastle need European football? I know it's a sign of progress, but could this also hinder the team moving forward?
Well, I mean, I think it's been a huge strain on them this season. I mean, you just go back to the Champions League group. They had AC Milan, Paris Saint-Germain, and Dortmund. I mean, incredible sort of list of teams. But
2 teams that made the Champions League semi-final.
Semi-finals,
but it was
talk about group of death.
Yeah, it was incredible, but they competed and they loved it, and I mean, I mean, this will sound trite, but I got to November and I was ready for the season to end, and I didn't do all of the away games. But it's just been that sort of season. It's felt like it's never ended. I can't believe this is still the same season as Paris Saint-Germain, and that is what kind of Europe does to you. Again, it's also what adversity does to you, and injuries, and because for a lot of the time it's been the same sort of team, the same sort of story. But it stretches them. But this is what elite clubs want. This is what they need. It's what players want, more importantly. And it's brilliant for fans to go to new places and experience all that. But no, I mean, it's a burden, but it's a beautiful burden. It's a burden that you want. It's a burden that Newcastle at this point in their progress absolutely need. What they have to find a way is just not to be as exposed as they have been this time. That's easier said than done. You can't plan for where injuries are going to hit you and how many injuries are going to hit you. But they have to find a way of bolstering their squad and being more prepared for it. And also, the lesser, in inverted commas, European competitions aren't necessarily going to provide you with that same glamour. Newcastle still have to learn how to treat every match as if it's a cup final. I mean, it's something that Manchester City are incredible at. They're able to have the same kind of attitude. Doesn't matter who they're playing. Newcastle have started to work on that really hard this season. And they absolutely need it.
Does that just also show that the magnitude of the work Eddie Howe's got to do in terms of reshaping a culture within a club? You're talking about going to these matches as their cup finals, but that's not something Newcastle are used to. It's not just the great football.
Do you mean reshaping cup finals?
Huh?
Are you having a dig at the lack of cup finals?
No. What he said, they're going into every match like they're a cup final. So is that reshaping a mentality in a club then, fundamentally? So you're able to operate within Europe at that level and then come back to the Premier League and change the pace of that, and then go to regional cups and then change the pace of that team and that squad for that as well.
It's incredibly difficult to do. I mean, even for the very best clubs. I mean, I mentioned Manchester City, but I mean, they're the exceptions in the way that they're able to do that. I mean, over the years, over the decades, we've seen teams struggle. When they've had heavily rotated teams for the League Cup or the FA Cup, but you have to sort of try and find a way through. I mean, it's all new. We have to remember this is all new for Newcastle. That being actively involved at this point of the season for positive reasons is a new experience. Yes, it happened last time, but before then you have to go a long way back for that to be a regular thing, let alone happen once. And I think some of that attitude we saw a little bit. I mean, certainly in terms of fans, going away to AC Milan. Now, I wrote a piece that day, spending the whole day with the fans, going to the away end at the San Siro, and fans were knackered by the time the match started because they'd given so much to, having a party all day. It was the same with Wembley, by the way, last season. Newcastle United won the weekend, and I am being silly when I say that. They won the weekend, but they lost the match. Newcastle have to learn how to be a club that wins those big moments, not the weekend, not the celebrating. Newcastle as a team were knackered by the time they got to the final last weekend because they've given out so much emotional energy. They have to learn how to be ruthless.
George, do you think Newcastle squad right now have enough bodies for European competition? Are there any problem positions you think could need thickening out?
Well, I mean, talking about Manchester United on Wednesday night at the moment, Callum Wilson missed out the weekend. He's only just come back into the squad after a pectoral muscle injury. He's been really good. He's been every inch the number 9 that Callum Wilson can be. He's now got an illness. Alexander Isak has got a bit of an illness. I would expect him to be involved tomorrow. But I mean, that is the area of the pitch that I'd have concern about. They've, neither of them have got brilliant injury records. And that would be area of the pitch that I would have concerns about. They've got issues at centre half and in midfield. They need quality everywhere. I mean, it's interesting that what they did last summer didn't really help them very much in terms of the first half of the season, because obviously Tonali gets his long suspension, Harvey Barnes gets a freak injury, Livramento and Lewis Hall, you could see what talented players they were. Livramento had Kieran Trippier, arguably the best right back in the Premier League, in front of him, and Hall struggled to impose himself. And so in the short term, that didn't help them in the Champions League at all. It didn't help them. It didn't help them in the extra competitions they were in at all. Now you're thinking, okay, well, maybe that looks like better business. But that's the thing, where you're trying your best to sort of strengthen your squad and strengthen your team at the same time. It's not easy to do at their level.
I mean, this then brings me to Manchester United in terms of the optics of not making European football next season. George says it's what elite clubs deserve. It's what they need. It's what they want. But actually, there's an argument to say that perhaps Manchester United just need a massive reset. No more distractions. Get it right. Get that transitional football right. And then we can start thinking of European football the season after. Will Manchester United's fan base allow for that?
This is a big question. So I did a piece last week on The Athletic about the weighing up the pros and cons of Conference League qualification, which, I mean, that was just writing that sentence out made me quite odd. The concept that Manchester United could be in the Conference League. I do have to thank you, Ayo. Your video with UEFA explaining the league stage is still the most distinct explanation of how
I'm still trying to figure out what it is, FYI. So,
it's the most distinct explanation I can find of how all these leagues will work. It's one of those things of when you get into next season's Champions, Europa and Conference League competition, you do need a diagram at some point, and you've done the best diagram.
I can do the spreadsheet if you need
now,
it. Now,
the argument that you put forward is, would Manchester United be better next season if they only have one game a week to focus on, rather than potentially being on the Thursday, Sunday treadmill of Europa competition? Last season, after they lost 1-0 against Brighton, Ten Hag was asked, why is Champions League qualification so important for Manchester United? And Ten Hag said, Manchester United should be in the Champions League because they're Manchester United. And he also said something I found quite interesting. He said, being in the Champions League makes Premier League competition easier. He said, when you're playing Tuesday, he basically said, words to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing here, so please forgive me, this was nearly a year ago. He said, words to the effect of, when you're playing Tuesday, Wednesday, you have more time to focus on what you need to do on the weekend, whereas when you're on the Thursday, Friday's for travelling back, Friday's for recovery, so you have limited work to do on the training field, and then you just have to get through what you're doing on Sunday. That was interesting to say. And then, one of the things that was being said in the middle of the really disappointing November, December for Manchester United was, well, if we're out of Champions League football, hopefully when all these players return from their injuries, with only one game a week, Manchester United should upturn in form, and they should be able to grab on to capitalise on mistakes Tottenham Hotspur and Aston Villa were doing. And what we've seen is just not that. Whatever method of football Ten Hag thought would be the optimum use for 2024 hasn't come off in the way that he's wanted, and the injury luck has been wrong. So, does playing only one game a week help with your injury luck? I don't know. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes in that medical department. We will probably only find out what was going on behind the scenes in that medical department in a couple more weeks when that season is over and everyone goes on holiday and everyone's just a little bit more chatty-patty because they're having an orangina. We'll see. However, when you're on Manchester United, and let's make no mistake, this is going to go down as historically one of the worst Manchester United seasons in Premier League history. If not, a lot of these records for Manchester United are so bad you have to stretch back to the old First Division and whatnot. You need to win games next season, and it's preferable to win a lot of games quite quickly in order to build a sense of momentum and to get back the fortress mentality that you talked about at Old Trafford, and to get rid of some of this scar tissue. The argument there is, the counter-argument to play only one game a week, the counter-argument is, well, you need to win. You need the dough of European competition. Okay, Europa League and Conference League
very different to Champions League.
Very different to Champions League. However, this new league stage format
Thank you very much.
This new league stage format means there's more games, more opportunities, more home games as well, and Manchester United can bring anywhere between 2 to 4 million in revenue on match day, so that can help the coffers a little bit. And there is a idea, a theory, you can call me an optimist, but if Manchester United were in a Conference League competition or Europa League competition, they should, without too much hard work, and you can see my pausing and upward inflection, be able to win a number of games before Christmas. So when Christmas comes along and you go, the first half of 24-25 is done, you're like, okay, Manchester United, they're in a good place. And I think that is a benefit of European competition, is that winning begets more winning. And George has talked about learning how to control emotions and learning how to be in big games and learning how to maneuver things. Ultimately, one day Manchester United will want to get past the Champions League quarterfinals, which is something they've not done since 2019. And in order to do that, you need to learn how to go play away in different parts of the world, play away and improve your record in certain things. Manchester United historically did not have the best record playing European games in Spain. And then they had a pretty successful Europa League campaign last season, beating Barcelona. Ten Hag talks about that very, very proudly. Beating Barcelona at home, but getting that draw at the Nou Camp. And that European record now has changed a little bit. There's a number of players in that Manchester United squad who now can feel like they can go away in Spain and do well. Okay, you're playing against Real Sociedad, but Real Sociedad were pretty good in the Champions League this season, I should say, as well. So this is the thing. My counter argument is, well, you need to learn to win games. You're kind of skint and you need some dough. So try and qualify for European competition rather than this great gamble that tactics and training time one a week will improve. Because I'm talking to you right now, and I want to be really mean about it. Manchester United only played one game week for a while in 2024, and I haven't seen any market improvement.
Just before we go, George,
I'm sorry.
It's too good. It's too good. No, because I feel like every time I talk to you about Manchester United, it's just offloading, and I'm glad to offer you a safe space to do that. It's therapy, isn't it? I mean, definitely. Before we go, super quick, and I think a lot of Newcastle fans in particular might need therapy just in case it happens. Is that we've questioned the Newcastle fans for Q&A, and I think Chris Woff, your colleague, covered a lot of those questions on the Athletic yesterday. Basically, I'd love to put one of those questions to you from Dan C. George, and he says, why was Bruno on the ground, head down, after the game at the weekend? Why is he leaving? I mean, he's already on the therapist's chair right now, but real talk, what's the chat around Bruno Guimarães? Because if you're talking about ambition, if you're talking about what Newcastle need to do in Europe, I mean, a player like him is so key, isn't he?
Yeah, he's the player who keeps this team ticking over. He's exceptional. When he does miss out, Newcastle can't win, and I think he and Alexander Isak are genuinely Newcastle's world-class stars. We have this horrible relationship with selling players, so you can go back to Gascoigne, Beardsley, Waddle. You can go back to that era, but of course you can go to Andy Cole and Andy Carroll. We have this visceral response to selling our best players and what it means. Now, of course, in the modern era, all clubs have to sell, but you have to sell at the right time for you. Now, Bruno has a £100 million release clause. It's active until the end of June, and so yeah, I suppose everybody feels a bit on tenterhooks about whether anybody will trigger that. And if you see a player with his head in his hands, sort of in tears at the end of a match, it's the final home game, it's like, oh no. Well, all I can say about that is that Bruno Guimarães, as I have to call him contractually, cries pretty much after he does anything. He's the kind of man who cries when the Andrex toilet tissue advert and all those lovely cuddly dogs come on I mean, like me,
it's a great advert.
It's a great
lovely advert. Puppies will make anyone cry.
He scores a goal, he cries. He doesn't score a goal, he cries. He is an incredibly emotional player. It's one of the reasons why he's loved so much. He puts everything into everything. Newcastle were chasing down Tottenham Hotspur in fifth. They had that as a target. By drawing against Brighton, it means it's unlikely, obviously, and he didn't have his best of games on Saturday, but you put everything in it like he always does. He got emotional. He gets emotional. I don't read anything into that at all. The bigger picture is that if someone comes in and bids £100 million, then Newcastle are vulnerable, but that has to happen. And at the moment, the feeling around Newcastle is that they don't think another club will come and trigger that, and therefore he'll stay. So, I understand that emotion because I share it myself, not just Bruno's emotion, because I cry at the. I mean, I'm almost in tears now. But so that, and also, sort of having this horrible visceral response to the idea of selling Newcastle's best players, because we've got such a horrible history of that.
Yeah, for sure. Dan, I hope that's calmed your nerves for now. But Carl's nerves are still skyrocketing as Manchester United play Newcastle on Wednesday at Old Trafford. The battle for Europe is on. George, Carl, thank you so much for your time. And do not forget to rate and review the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. We're back tomorrow. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anka, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.